Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Boulder Ecosystem Summit 2020. Thank you for joining us. I recognize that the University of Colorado Boulder sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. Good morning. My name is Sharon Collins, and I am a professor of environmental studies here at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the second of 3 such sessions that we're hosting this week that comprise this year's Boulder Ecosystem Summit 2020, and will focus on the Boulder Ecosystem Trends Report. We are thrilled that you have chosen to participate today, and we look forward to an active and constructive dialogue with you as we delve into understanding our local ecosystems from a variety of perspectives. These 3 sessions will each be recorded and made publicly available on our website, cslc.colorado.edu. I'd like to now introduce Amanda Carrico, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies here at CU Boulder and Interim Director of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. Amanda?
Hi, thanks so much, Sharon. And it's really great to be with you today. I appreciate you taking the time to log in and participate in this webinar. So my name is Amanda Carrico, and I am the Interim Director of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities, as Sharon said. And it's my pleasure to kick off this event today, which is the second of 3 meetings associated with this year's Ecosystem Summit. So before we dig in, I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce who we are as the center and what we do. So we are a center that is housed at CU Boulder, but I think I like to kind of describe it as a partnership, a cross-sector partnership that involves concerned organizations and citizens in the Boulder community working in collaboration with researchers at the university. We're really lucky to have a vibrant community of participants, including CU faculty, staff, and students, as well as many local agencies, including Boulder County Parks and Open Space, the City of Boulder, the Boulder Watershed Collective, and a whole host of others that are shown on our website that Sharon's showing you there. And we also benefit immensely from the participation of many local residents and leaders in the community. And so we're grateful for that involvement, and we welcome others to get engaged in what we do. So this morning's event represents one of many ongoing initiatives that we as a center have unfolding. It's designed to facilitate respectful and productive discussion, as all of our events are, around the health and stewardship of our natural resources in Boulder. And so if you're interested in this and the other kinds of events that we host, please check out our website to learn a bit more about what we've got coming up. And you're also welcome to sign up to receive notifications. If you're interested in hearing about what we've got coming down the pipeline, you can sign up to receive mailers that let you know when those events will be held. So I want to take a quick moment to note that while we're really fortunate to receive support through a lot of dedicated hours from volunteers and collaborators, we also do rely heavily on donations from members of the community. So if you enjoy and benefit from this event or the other events that we put on, I invite you to consider making a donation to the center so that we can continue this important work. 100% of these donations feed back into supporting the cost of research and to organizing events like this that we really hope to continue keeping open and accessible as much as possible. So we're really grateful for your support and any support you give in the future, whether that be monetary or simply through participating in these discussions like today. And so we're glad you're here. I hope you enjoyed today's program, and I look forward to continuing our dialogue as we move forward. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Amanda. So what I'm showing you here on the screen is the front page, if you will, of the 2020 Ecosystem Trends Report. This is available in digital form on our website, cslc.colorado.edu. We've also produced a downloadable PDF of this report, which is about 70 pages long. So if you go to the Executive Summary tab here on this page of our report, you can scroll down. There are a few questions that we're asking about who you are and how you hope to use the report in your work or in your educational activities, and then you'll be able to download the PDF. So there's no hard copy format of this report, and that's intentional. We're trying to reduce the use of paper and make this available in a digital format. So this report is the culmination of a variety of conversations and activities. And so I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the report. The report emerged out of a collaboration between the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities and the City of Boulder's Climate Initiatives Division. And together in fall of 2018, we planned and hosted a one-day gathering on cities, ecosystems, and climate change. And perhaps many of you attended that event. One outcome of that event was an identified need and motivation to regularly track and communicate the status and trends of Boulder County's ecosystems and ecosystem services. And so, as you all know, Boulder County has a long history of community engagement with our local and regional ecosystems. And this report is an opportunity to further that engagement. So because our communities here in Boulder are increasingly connected with regional and global dynamics of environmental change, we believe that now is a critical moment to both understand and respond to those changes. So the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities was identified as an ideal entity to engage students, faculty, and community members to collate information from diverse sources to produce the first of its kind Boulder Ecosystems Trends Report. Through several public gatherings in 2019 and 2020, our center brought together CU students, faculty, advisors, and community stakeholders to identify data types and sources that are relevant to understanding current ecosystem status and trends. A long list of potential trends was vetted through community members and local land management agency staff, with the end result of a prioritized list of 6 categories of data types to be collated and synthesized for this 2020 Trends Report. And I want to point out that this is the first of its kind Boulder Ecosystems Trends Report. We hope that we will continue to do this every 2 years. And so we look to you, the community, for input on additional trends that you want to know more about and that we can learn about and communicate. These 6 trend categories then were chosen based on their relevance to local policy and management, the availability of high quality data sources to inform the trend, and their direct impact on tracking environmental change. So the 6 categories of trends for this year that we centered on were climate, soil health, watershed health, air quality, biodiversity, and urban land cover. For each of these trend categories, our project team identified and wrote 3 stories. And each of these stories provides information and data on the specific trends. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support, financial support provided by these funders, the City of Boulder Climate Initiatives Department, the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, Boulder County Parks and Open Space, Boulder County Office of Sustainability, Climate and Resilience, and the Boulder County Parks and Open Space Foundation, as well as the Community Foundation, Boulder County. Many, many people contributed data, expertise, advice, and reviews of our materials. And so I'd like to thank this long list of project contributors. These contributions were obviously essential to our being able to complete this report. I'd also like to especially thank the folks listed here, including the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities Advisory Board, Amanda Carrico, the interim director, and Aaron Freed, the research and outreach program coordinator. Finally, I'd like to say especially big thanks to our project team, Karen Bailey, Raina Benzeev, Sarah Jaffe, and Kika Tuff, who all worked very hard on gathering the data from a variety of sources, on analyzing and visualizing the data that you see in this report, and especially to Kika, who is the scientist storyteller who creatively put these stories together in the form that you see in the report. So I'd like to just briefly go through our format for today's webinar. After this introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, which will be Amanda Carrico, who will spend about 10 or 15 minutes walking you through the 6 stories on the trends for today, which are watershed health and air quality. Then we'll have a chance to hear from our invited guests, and Amanda will introduce those guests to you to get their take on what they see in these trends and how they interpret the findings. That will take us about halfway through this webinar. And at the halfway point, we'll take a quick break and administer an online survey to you, just again to learn more about who you are and how you hope to use this report. And this will feed back into the research of Karen Bailey, who is an assistant professor in environmental studies, who will be analyzing this information to understand the impact of this report on our community. After the survey, we'll open up the webinar for questions, insights, comments, and suggestions from all of you. And you can use the Q&A function in the webinar toolbar that you see at the bottom of your screen. So please type in your questions as they arise. These will be fielded by Amanda, our moderator, and may be directed to specific guests or to the group in general. During the webinar, we'll also be posting on social media, both Instagram and Twitter, and so please feel free to join us in doing so using the hashtag Boulder Ecosystem Summit. Thanks again for being here. I really look forward to your input and to your great questions. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Amanda Carrico, my colleague and Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Interim Director of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. Thanks, Amanda.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So let me just get my screen up here, and then we can start diving into these 2 trends on watershed health and air quality. Oh, Sharon, I think you need to release the share screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'll start with a short discussion of what we can see emerging out of this report related to watershed health. So if you've read the report, you know that the focus here is on 3 indicators that speak to the health of our watersheds in Boulder. The first of these has to do with the presence of these organisms that we call benthic macroinvertebrates, or BMIs for short. Let me make sure that, okay. So benthic macroinvertebrates, BMIs, they live in our streams and creeks, and you probably know them more colloquially as things like dragonflies, mayflies, midges, snails, beetles, other sorts of organisms. Why do we care about BMIs? Like why are they helpful in understanding watershed health? Well, we know that they spend most of their time living in or around water. And we also know that BMIs tend to be highly sensitive to pollution. And so we can learn something about underlying water quality by looking at the abundance of BMI species, as well as the composition of their populations that live in the sort of water systems in our community. And so that's what this report is doing. So you're seeing here a map that plots data that was generated by the Left Hand Watershed Center, and we have Jessie Olson with us today to talk a little bit more about the work she's done in this area, as well as data from the city of Boulder. And both of these sources of data describe BMI populations along the Boulder Creek, as well as the Left Hand Creek. And you can see those sort of creeks plotted here, Boulder in the southern side of this map of Boulder County, and Left Hand on the northern side. So the larger these circles, the better it indicates the underlying water quality is. And when we look at the patterns that appear on this map, we can come to a few general conclusions about what we see related to water quality in the area. So first, I think we can say that water quality is generally, though not always, but generally better in the foothills and the higher elevations relative to the lower elevations. You can see the sizes of those circles sort of getting smaller as they move downhill. Second, and this is a really positive, I think, outcome of this report, is that we see that both the Left Hand and the Boulder Creeks are generally meeting state standards for the levels of water quality, the sort of lower limits of water quality derived from these BMI indicators. So all the sampling locations in Boulder Creek met those state standards, given what's considered an acceptable score. And you can see the ones that did, and across both the creeks by the sort of lime green outline around those circles. Those are locations that met those state standards. But we do see that a few sites in Left Hand Creek failed to meet these state standards. And there's at least a couple of explanations as to why this might be. One is that we know that upstream from some of these locations, there are the presence of a few mines, and particularly the Captain Jack mine, that may be leading to acidic mine drainage that's affecting the habitats and the quality of water downstream from them. And then further in lower elevations, we see some declining water quality, and likely due to lower flows, which affect both the habitat of these BMI populations, as well as the quality of the water when the kind of nutrients and pollutants get concentrated in lower volumes of water. So that's the first indicator regarding benthic macroinvertebrates. The second indicator that was looked at in the report considers snowpack, right? So snowpack, obviously of huge importance for overall water quality and availability in our region. We know that the snow that accumulates in the mountains each winter is our primary water source in Boulder County. It represents about 80% of total precipitation in a year. And it's really the source of the water that flows through the streams and creeks, during the warmer months, that provides that important habitat for the little critters that we just talked about in the last story. So we're lucky in Boulder County to have data describing snowpack going back decades, thanks to the large scientific community and officials that are collecting these data. And the data in this report comes specifically from the National Resources Conservation Service of Colorado, including sites that collect snowpack data in the Niwot Ridge LTER, which is where you're seeing the source of this image here. So these two figures show you snowpack measured in two watersheds. The top is the St. Vrain watershed, and on the bottom, you're seeing data collected from the Boulder Creek watershed. Both of them are showing you snowpack as represented as the percent of the median over time. And across the months, as you can see running down the legend on the right, the different colored lines are representing different months over these years. And so here 100% could be considered sort of an average rate of snowpack accumulation across that 30-year time span. So what can we say about these data? What do we see emerging from this data set? Well, we can say one, that clearly snowpack has fluctuated over time. So we see some kind of declining snowpack accumulation, especially in the early 2000s, some slight increases in recent years. As snowpack varies over time, we certainly know that contributes to overall ecological health in our community. It can contribute to arid conditions that may support, or in some cases more wet conditions that may mitigate exposure to things like fire. So it has a host of consequences for our regional ecological health. We can also see that since about 2015, snowpack conditions have been about right at or a little bit above the median. So that's a sort of positive story coming out of the last few years. But we also see some relatively high variability in the early and late season months. So early seasons of January, especially in the St. Vrain watershed, and in late season in June, it's particularly in the Boulder Creek watershed where that data was available. And so this sort of variability really introduces quite a bit of uncertainty, unpredictability into these patterns. And I'm hoping that in our panel discussion, we can talk a little bit about how we as a community ought to be thinking about coping with this kind of uncertainty and planning ahead, given some uncertainty in how we manage water in our community. All right, so our final indicator related to watershed health is related to land use and land cover change in the region. So anyone who's been in Boulder for a while knows that we've seen tremendous amounts of population growth in the area, in the Front Range in general, but also specifically in Boulder County. So in Boulder County alone, we've seen population increase by as much as 600% since 1950, moving from a little less than 50,000 persons in the 50s to as many as 330,000 people living in Boulder County today. So, and with more people comes the need for, of course, more housing, more infrastructure, more roads, more industry, and this has consequences for water quality, of course. So this map is showing you the footprint of urban areas in the county as they looked in 1950. So if you look at the sort of red, orange, and yellow shading, that's showing you the urban footprint in our county at that point in time. And we can compare that to 2020. You can see a really sort of large scale expansion of urban spaces in our area. So again, sort of comparing 1950 here to 2020, and you can see Boulder sort of in the center of this map. I can't quite get a pointer, but in the sort of middle center is, of course, the area of the city of Boulder. So how is this related to watershed health, right? So, well, with the growth of urban areas comes the expansion, of course, of impervious surfaces that affects the absorption of water into the ground and our ability to replenish groundwater resources. It affects the flow of water as it runs down streams and into city areas and as it falls through the rain. More pollution it introduces more pollution via lawn chemicals and roadways and other kinds of sources. Industries, businesses, the things that kind of seep out of our cars, for example. And it also leads to more disruptions to aquatic habitats that supports ecosystem. And so it has potentially profound impacts. Now, the story of population, of course, could fold into a lot of the different trends that we talk about over the course of this report, but it's particularly important to the story of water quality as well. All right, so that is the story of watershed health. Let's turn our attention now to what we learned about air quality, which is the fourth trend in this report. And here we're going to consider 3 indicators of air quality. The first being information about ozone in our area. So ozone is a gas that works to our benefit when it lives in the high levels of the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, where it helps to filter out UV rays. But it also can accumulate in the lower levels of the atmosphere and can become particularly unsafe for our respiratory health, and especially for those in our community who deal with respiratory challenges like asthma or COPD, the very young and the very old especially. The EPA sets a national standard for ambient ozone pollution at 0.0 parts per million. And this graph is showing you peak ozone concentrations measured at the Boulder Reservoir from 2017 to 2020. You can see the line sort of in the center of the graph is showing you that threshold of that 0.07 parts per million. And these data are coming from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And you can see that if you look at the fluctuations over time, you can see that every year we have several days that exceed that EPA threshold for what's considered safe. We can also say that peak concentrations of ozone tend to occur more in the summer months when we have hotter and drier conditions that are more conducive to the formation of ozone and that lead to some of the air quality alert days that we hear about in the news and that are particularly difficult especially for those of us that have respiratory challenges. So in the past 3 years, this has translated into between about 26 or 40 days in which ozone levels have exceeded the EPA threshold. You're seeing the kind of numbers over years there. And most of these, again, are occurring during the summer months. So the second indicator that we looked at is regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And so in contrast to the story that we just heard regarding ozone, greenhouse gas emissions most of the time are not directly impacting us through damage to our lungs, but rather to its role in causing the accumulation of heat in the atmosphere, which is essentially leading to global warming. And we heard more about global warming on Saturday during our first webinar, and there's quite a bit more content that lives in this report that speaks to how climate change is impacting the Boulder community. So there's a lot more to say about this, but let's talk a bit about some of the emissions that are emerging out of our community that are leading to global warming impacts. So this report takes a close look, especially at the greenhouse gas emission methane, which is a shorter lived, but many times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And methane has been a concern in the Colorado community, especially in recent years with the expansion of oil and gas production in the area, which is a major contributor of methane emissions. It also comes, of course, though, from feedlots, from landfills, from the behaviors that you and I participate in our daily lives. So this data collected in, well, let me back up for a moment just to say that, an exciting development in Colorado is that we've really led the nation in trying to pass policies to deal or to cope with, regulate methane emissions from those industries, which happened in 2014. But you can see here the data, the trend in methane emissions over time, starting in 1984 through 2020. This data was collected at the Niwot Ridge site. And you can see it shows a real dramatic upward and persistent trend in the accumulation of methane in the atmosphere in the region. A real story of sort of dramatic shifts over time here. All right, the final indicator for air quality is VOCs, volatile organic compounds. 2 VOCs were considered in this report. VOC is ethane and propane, which are 2 gases that are emitted during oil and gas production and processing. And they're 2 that were tracked because they're relatively easier to measure. And they serve as indicators of more general sets of emissions that emerge out of the industry. So this figure is showing you propane emissions specifically, although the image that shows you ethane emissions looks quite similar. But this one is showing you propane over time from 2017 to 2020, collected at the Boulder Reservoir by Boulder Air in partnership with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and Boulder County Public Health. And so one important kind of story with these VOC emissions is that in contrast to what we see with ozone, VOCs accumulate more in the wintertime, suggesting that there may be greater air quality concerns stemming from oil and gas production in the cooler months. And so, kind of combine that with what the story we just heard about ozone, and we start to see a picture where we have sort of air quality concerns evolving year round in the Boulder community. So another kind of implication of this is that, as you might expect, as you move closer to these production sites, we see evidence that VOC concentrations start to intensify. I'm showing you here the same data. So the data on the figure on the bottom there is the same data that we just looked at, collected at Boulder Reservoir. But now I'm showing this in comparison to the data collected at the Longmont Union Reservoir. Also propane emissions. Now, the time steps of these graphs are a little bit different, but the important takeaway conclusion here is that you can see that VOC concentrations increase by several orders of magnitude when you're moving closer to those production sites, and in Longmont, where you have a higher density of production sites and you're in closer proximity to those sites. So we're excited to hear more about from our air quality specialists what the sort of implications of this may be and what we can think about doing about it. All right, so that is the story of watershed health and air quality that was focused on in this ecosystem trends report. If you haven't read the report, I highly recommend it. There's a lot more detail to the story I just told. And so what I'd like to do now is bring in our panel. So I'll invite our panel to turn on their videos. Let me get my, yeah, and so let me introduce who we have today. And what I'll do is I'll start with, after I introduce our panel, I'll start with a first question to get our dialogue going. And then after we go through that first round of questions, we'll have a very brief pause where you'll take a survey and we can regroup, and then we'll look forward to hearing your questions next. So let me start by introducing Jessie Olson. Jessie is the Executive Director of the Left Hand Watershed Center, and her work focuses on watershed health and restoration. And we were lucky to see some of the data that her organization has been involved in collecting related to the Left Hand Watershed, the benthic populations there. Cindy Copeland is an air quality specialist in Boulder County, and her office contributed data for the air quality trends that we just looked at. Karen Dyke is a board secretary for Sustainable Resilient Longmont, and she's been engaged in a lot of local community efforts to respond to some of the air quality concerns, especially in the area. And Helen Gamil has expertise in international economics and water policy. She's an environmental philanthropist and not engaged in nonprofit consulting, and she supported us in providing some perspective on the watershed health trend stories. So really great to have you all here. Thanks for taking the time. I'm going to start with a first question for you, Jessie. So as we just heard, you've been directing the Left Hand Watershed Center for several years now. And I'm wondering if you can provide a bit more kind of perspective to the data we just looked at regarding water quality in that area. Specifically, we saw a bit of a snapshot from 2016 and 18, but we don't know as much about how that water quality has changed over time. So could you talk a little bit about what we know or don't know about changes over time and what, if anything, is driving those changes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I am Jessie Olson, Executive Director with Left Hand Watershed Center, and we work to protect and restore watersheds for people and the environment using a science-based and collaborative approach. And you're welcome to visit our website to learn more about what we do and find further details on watershed health trends in our State of the Watershed report. And it presents this data in a little bit more detail. I wanted to see if you could bring up the one chart that I provided for you, and Amanda did a great job of giving an overview of what the issues are that we're seeing in Left Hand Creek watershed. And just to put it very simply, the main issues in the upper watershed are related to mine-related reclamation issues. And then in the lower watershed, we have issues related to lack of flows or diversions. So this chart shows 3 years of data that we've collected on benthic macroinvertebrates. So the same same reporting, same sort of analysis that was shown in the charts Amanda showed. And we have on the left side of the chart, peak to peak highway. So it's basically, you can think of it as going from the headwaters all the way down to the plains. So 81st Street on the far right side of the chart is near Highway 119. And you can see two dashed lines going across the chart. The dark black dashed line is what we would consider attainment, which is the state standards for attainment. And then the lighter gray dashed line is impairment. So off the bat here, you can see that there are a couple sites in the watershed which do not meet the state standards or are actually considered impaired. And so those are in the upper watershed, where we have this area right below Captain Jack Mine, where we had a mine-related spill recently, or a planned release that actually led to some fish kills in 2018. And then in the lower portion of the watershed, you see a dramatic decline between two of the sites, and between the ranch site and what we call Kavar, which is another privately owned property. But basically that big drop is right at the point of a diversion, where the water actually comes down to very, very little water most times of the year. So we're finding that basically the diversion is causing this sharp decline in water quality in the lower portion of the watershed. And then we have this great sweet spot in the middle of the watershed, where we're seeing great well above attainment in the kind of what we would call the foothills area of the watershed. And then one other thing I'll point out is that the upper left-hand site and the 81st Street site are both restoration sites that we have restored in 2017. And what I'm seeing there is an increase in terms of an improvement in water quality between 2016 and 2019. And so that could be attributed to the work that we did in terms of doing in-stream restoration. And in particular, on 81st Street, there was significant growth of wetland vegetation along the stream margins, which could really result in that improvement in water quality. So a hopeful story there in terms of things we can do in the future.
Thank you, Jesse. And sorry, there's a lot of windows here. Let me just get my to where I can see my questions. And I think next I'd like to talk to turn it over to you, Helen, and talk a little bit more about sort of the snowpack data. And so we saw evidence of relatively stable snowpack conditions in the St. Vrain and Boulder Creeks, at least in recent years. But there are a lot of concerns that aren't represented in those data about overall water quality, such as the sort of rising temperatures, lower rainfall patterns in some cases, that are contributing to drought conditions and general concerns about our water availability. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit to the general picture about water availability and your outlook, especially regarding what the community can be doing now in the future to prepare for what the future might look like in that respect.
Sure, thank you so much. Well, it's a mixed outlook, I would say, from sort of a personal level, and this is something that I have been quite interested in personally, is how safe are we in Boulder as citizens, and what does our water access look like into the future with these twin pressures of climate change and population growth. And I'll just say, first of all, that Boulder City and County are very well positioned because of the way the water law works here with what's called the doctrine of prior appropriations. Boulder City has very old water rights. And so in the presence of scarcity, the older the rights, the more senior sort of priority you have. So in terms of any sort of crisis of scarcity, Boulder itself is well positioned. We had talked about that. However, on a larger scale, looking at the fact that Boulder and the state take our water supply from both snowmelt from glaciers, which are shrinking, and the Colorado River, where the supply is dwindling and the pressures on where the supply goes is growing because of climate change. and population growth. We have a lot of work to do there. There's a lot of great work being done. And I think, something like this trends report is a wonderful way to have a baseline, to be armed with data. And something that we can do to one of your questions as citizens is start connecting the dots for where the expertise on water is with action. And that's happening a lot, but one particular place where I think more can be done is looking at, because water policy and water law is so complex here, it's difficult for policymakers like legislators to have expertise in that. So the more voters can show concern and engagement on these issues to their policymakers, the more the policymakers can make decisions around renegotiating the Colorado River Compact or holding the governor's feet to the fire around this wonderful Colorado water plan that was enacted in 2015, or signed in 2015, but the enactment is still in process, and the policymakers are trying to figure out still where the funding for that will come from. Things that you can do is call your legislators, but also legislators sign up for being volunteers for things like Protect Our Winters, which was an organization cited in the Trends report, to be a volunteer there, and they can help arm you with talking points. Conservation Colorado is another organization that helps educate lawmakers on what to think about for policy issues. That's more big picture. And then the more sort of what can you do in your backyard stuff was linked a little bit in the Trends report, which is things like don't use toxic chemicals on your lawn, pick up animal waste, educate your neighbors, don't wash your car with soapy water because that all affects the water quality. But in terms of the big picture of water quantity and access, it is a big looming question, and there is not an overarching sort of plan in place. It's being negotiated as we speak, and because it's so complicated, there doesn't tend to be negotiations until we're in a crisis, and they're forced. So the more that we can sort of force the conversation as engaged citizens, the better. And I think one thing this latest election round has showed us is so much is that democracy is such a citizen, and it's a contact sport, and the more we can all be engaged and elect people who care about prioritizing water, the better. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I realize it's a complicated question. I appreciate the thoughts. Yeah. So let's turn over and have a couple questions regarding air quality. So I'll start with you, Cindy. So we just saw some concerning data regarding ozone and VOC pollution in the area. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about ozone. So one of the things that the Trends report noted is that the conditions that lead to ozone production and concentrations of ozone can be quite regionally specific. And so maybe you could say a little bit about what's going on in Boulder that's contributing to ozone and what we should be doing to mitigate the problem.
Yeah, so to start, I'm the Air and Climate Policy Analyst for Boulder County Public Health. So I oversee one of my roles is overseeing the air quality monitoring study that we have, that we've had going on at the Boulder Reservoir for the last several years. And so that is monitoring volatile organic compounds as well as nitrogen oxides. And that station is actually co-located with its CDPHE's ozone monitor. And so we are able to take that data and compare the ozone data with the VOC and the NOx concentrations that we get from our own data. And part of the reason that we do that is because ozone is made up of VOCs and NOx. And so there's a lot of complicated factors in ozone production and the sources of ozone production, and then how to deal with that problem. So two of the major sources of VOC and NOx pollution are oil and gas and vehicles. And, those are two really difficult sources to control. There are a lot of efforts being made at the local, state, and federal level. So, we see kind of it's a mixture of those pollutants, and they come together typically in the summer afternoons, as we see sunnier conditions, warmer conditions. That's when the ozone levels start to rise. And so it's really, it starts out low in the summer in the mornings, and then it continues to rise in the afternoons to often get us to the unsafe conditions that we see. And the ozone conditions are something that we're really concerned about in this area. The Denver metro area has been what they call non-attainment for ozone for quite some time. And there are actually two different federal ozone standards. So there's the 0.07 standard that was mentioned in the trends report. The Denver area, unfortunately, is designated under, this is under the Federal Environmental Protection Agency standards. We're designated non-attainment for both the 0.07 standard and also the 0.075 standard, which doesn't, on its face, doesn't make a lot of sense that we're still non-attainment for the older standard, but it's because we haven't achieved that standard yet. And so we're still working on the plans, which are the plans that the state puts together to achieve those standards. And so part of what we do at the Boulder County level is that we use our data and our policy and regulatory expertise to argue at the state for a stronger ozone plan, one that will actually bring the area into attainment. So that's one of our key concerns. And then we also use our monitoring data to argue for stronger regulations, specifically for oil and gas and for vehicles. There's been a number of rulemakings at the state's Air Quality Control Commission that we've been involved in the last many years, really, on that level, and also there are a number of climate rulemakings that the state has planned, and there was one last year. And so all of that information goes into arguing for tougher controls. And really, the bottom line is we're a public health agency and we want to protect public health. And we're arguing for stronger and stronger controls in order to do that.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, great for sharing additional sort of background on the sources of the uses of those data. So let me engage you, Karen, next. So you've been involved in a lot of community-based efforts in an attempt to really balance the goals of protecting the environment with our goals of having a thriving economy, right? This is a kind of a fundamental tension in a lot of this conversation around ecological health. And so I hope that you can share your perspective on this, and specifically what residents of Longmont are doing to address the really dramatic air quality concerns that we saw showing up in this report. What's going on in Longmont?
Yeah. Thank you. It's really interesting. I tell people that when you work with an issue like oil and gas, it's really hard not to feel powerless. And so, I try to work with a lot of different organizations to see how we can make some of this work. There's a group, our Longmont, that actually in 2012 passed a ban that was overturned by the state Supreme Court when we were sued by the oil and gas industry. And so right now, after the passage of 181, which was a series of legislation passed in 2019 that said local governments can have stronger regulations, we are trying to get that ban back in place. We lost in district court, and so now, in district court, and so we'll probably go on to the appeals court, and it'll probably end up in Supreme Court again. But the citizens do get to speak. We also there's some important things happening with the Boulder County regulations right now. Boulder County has had a moratorium. That moratorium ends as soon as they enact some new regulations. And those are undergoing approval right now. So if you're interested, you can certainly go out to the Boulder County website and find that out. I also belong to an organization called Sustainable Resilient Longmont. And we pay some attention to fracking, but more to trying to move towards renewable energy. And I think that's where we'll really see that we can finally maybe get away from the air pollution, is to move more rapidly to renewable energy. One of the large polluters in the northern Front Range area is actually the Rawhide electricity generating plant up in Larimer County. So anyway, that's one thing we work on, is trying to get them to move away from coal for generation. And you know, it's hard. We do have some good data. I don't know, Amanda, if you want to show the data that we have. We do have some good data, but the thing is, it's really hard to prove which well it came from. And so it's very difficult, other than on a more global area, to talk about how do we look at this. So as we look at this, you can see, and this happens to be benzene and toluene, it looks like, and we can see that the purple line is Longmont Union Reservoir. The Boulder Reservoir, I believe, is the blue one. There are also two sites down in Broomfield along the Northwest Parkway between I-25 and 287, and they frequently also have high levels. So you can see toluene. For some reason, I do have asthma, and toluene happens to be one that really bothers my asthma. So I frequently look at this data before I go out, and it was high this morning. You can see that the benzene and toluene have both been high. So I tend to look and see where are they at before I even go out for a walk. Actually, wearing a mask helps. The state is also looking at writing regulations for the SB 181. And they aren't going as far as I would like them to, but hopefully they'll make some sense of some of the high levels of pollutants. And the AQCC, which is the Air Quality Commission, is also looking at these, and I'm sure Cindy and Boulder County is working on that. But a number of different organizations have are interacting with those regs to try and make them something that is a little better. It's difficult when you have, I think there's like 60,000 wells currently producing, and it's hard to say you have to shut down your well because that's why my benzene level's up. So it becomes more needing a more statewide, regional effort to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. Well, great. So let me just have us all take a quick pause at this moment. So as Sharon mentioned, we're going to ask the audience to complete, if you would, a very brief survey to collect a little bit of data about what brought you here and what your interests are for using this report. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, the panel will have a chance to sort of refocus on the questions that are coming in through the Q&A. So the Q&A is open. If you have a question you'd like to compose for one of the panelists or all of them, please feel free to do that. And we'll take about 3 minutes or so to give you a chance to answer these survey questions. Take a quick break if you need to, and we'll reconvene in just about 3-4 minutes. The link to the survey, is that visible, Sharon?
Yes, that's in the chat.
There's a link in the chat. Excuse me. Yes, thank you. The link in the chat that will take you directly to that survey. So we'll let you do that now. Thank you. All right, so if you could just wrap up quickly the survey, and then we'll get started here in just a few minutes, few seconds, I should say. I'll invite our panelists to rejoin us. All right, so let's dive in. So we've got a lot of great questions flowing in, and please continue posing those. Let me start with a couple questions that just popped up about the role of animal agriculture for both air quality and water quality. And so maybe I'll start, Cindy, if you could talk a little bit about animal agriculture as it relates to air quality, and then we can engage Helen and Jesse on the discussion of water quality.
Yeah, so agriculture
Cindy,
is. Oh, can you
Sorry,
hear me?
go ahead, I can hear you, yeah.
Agriculture is, definitely a source of pollution for, it's affecting ozone levels and methane pollution. But as far as controlling that source under federal policies and state of Colorado policies, there's no ability to regulate agriculture as a source category. And so any measures have to be voluntary, any reduction measures. There are efforts, in particular, there's a effort for nitrogen deposition at Rocky Mountain National Park. And agriculture is a huge source of that problem. And that's a, air quality and water problem. And under that agreement that's between the state of Colorado and several federal agencies, agriculture does have voluntary reduction measures that they take. And the only part of agriculture's contribution to air quality that would be regulated is the vehicles, the farm equipment used. And so those do have to come under federal EPA requirements for the fuel standards and the emissions from those vehicles.
Thanks. So Helen and Jesse, would either of you like to discuss a little bit the side of this in terms of air quality or water quality?
I would just add to, let's see, in Colorado, emotionally, I think in the sort of ethos of the culture and politically, cattle ranching and agriculture is sort of like, well, I'll make a pun, is sort of a sacred cow. And so it's been, to Cindy's point, it's been difficult, I think, it's complicated, it's tricky to regulate it, I would say. So even if the science points right in that direction, it's sort of politically a tricky knot to do that.
Great, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, and I would say, like, in terms of the science side of things, the data we collect really is looking at a larger scale than kind of pinpointing a specific issue to a specific farm, and being able to sort of tie direct sort of land use actions to the data you're collecting. You would have to kind of set that up in an experimental context, which we do for other things, but so I think that would kind of need to be done to sort of answer that question directly. And then there was a question about the septic systems, and that's kind of the same sort of response that I have there, is like our data is for the entire watershed, and we can't necessarily kind of get to the fine scale of like, this septic system is leaking into the river, therefore this water quality sample is showing a decline in the MMI score. It might pick that up, but it's not sort of set up to show that kind of fine scale detail. It's more of a large scale watershed issues that are not directly pinned to one particular point source.
Go ahead, Helen.
Thank you. I was just going to add too that regarding the state of a lot of these efficiencies and innovations being voluntary, there are a lot of groups, the Nature Conservancy is one, that work closely with farmers. There's another great one called Mad Agriculture, and they're partnering with farmers on the ground to sort of pilot some of these voluntary projects, like they're looking at water banking, for example, as a potential way to increase efficiency and conservation going forward. And the thinking is to prove that with these pilot projects that it can work and that it's not going to end up, because I think the fear is that people who have water rights, because there's this, if you don't lose it, you use it around water rights here. That's the law. So there's this fear that if a farmer does anything to change it, then she might lose her water rights. But as more innovative approaches are being tested, more innovative solutions are sort of being proven, and then the trust can slowly build sort of on the ground in the community from sort of neighbor to neighbor. Like, I tried this and it worked. You could try it too. So things like that are happening. They're just not regulated yet, and they're not happening at a large scale. But I do have a lot of optimism because they are happening, and there is some will to make it happen at a larger scale.
Great.
Just to happen
and let me invite Karen into this conversation, because you've done so much work with engaging community members. Do you share that optimism, or can you speak to sort of what's happening in Longmont around those kinds of relationship building?
I think a lot of this is educating communities. So, I think for sort of the agricultural piece, there's a lot of effort for people to be more engaged in how they use their land. And I think just educating on, you might not want to be vegetarian, but maybe you can go meatless 1 or 5 days a week. It won't really deprive you that much. I think also eventually I don't think we have any feedlot type things close by. That would be maybe on out in the plains, but some of the ground actually does fine if there's cows there, as long as we aren't in these feedlot areas, which are really unnatural. So I think we need to, and that's sort of a community education, which takes a long time. But I think it's something we can certainly work on, both through agriculture and our own personal habits.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So let's move on to a next question from Dinah about the relationship between ozone and public health. And so the question is whether Boulder County is tracking vulnerable populations and how they're responding to these issues related to ozone, and what can we do about protecting those groups that are especially vulnerable here. Maybe Cindy, you can start.
Yeah, I can answer that. So I don't know the percents off the top of my head, but the American Lung Association every year puts out a state of the air report. And though you can find the percents of the numbers for vulnerable populations in their report, and that's by county. So that will give you the number of people with pediatric asthma, adult asthma, COPD, lung cancer, and other lung diseases and respiratory diseases. So I would go there, and I could drop that link into the Q&A if that helps. And as far as tracking, we don't have the ability to track those populations, per se, to reach out to every vulnerable person. But I will say that everything that we do, which is really, we have a coalition of local governments that we work with, and that coalition is growing, and it involves most of the local governments in the Denver metro area, specifically to push for stronger standards for ozone and, more controls that will reduce our ozone levels. Everything that we do is to protect everyone's health, but in particular the vulnerable populations.
Right. And Karen, yeah, you've mentioned your experiences there. You want to chime in?
Yes, yes. I should preface this by saying I'm a retired registered nurse, so this is kind of my geek area. Um, when you look at ozone, I heard a physician once say that breathing in ozone is like using sandpaper on the inside of your lungs, right? It's very corrosive, and so we need some way to alert people. And you know, we've looked at this and asked the city of Longmont to put out an alert when the ozone's really high. You can get an alert on your phone through the state, but I don't believe that it, and maybe Cindy knows where that ozone level comes from, but you can get an air quality alert. But the VOCs are also very damaging, particularly to young children. So they have more difficulty clearing these because their lungs and their livers aren't as they aren't as large, and they just can't clear the benzene and toluene as well as an adult can. And these VOCs, at times these are like trapped lower to the ground. So if you think of children playing in the playground and such, the VOCs at very low levels are very harmful to their young bodies. And so I think that's why we see some of the high rates of pediatric asthma and such when they live close to oil and gas and some of the other things that that some of the research is showing. It's just amazing to me that that this is allowed. When I first retired and started working in this area, I thought, wow, you can actually draw blood benzene levels. I worked in nursing for 40 years and I didn't know you could do that. And so, you know, that's part of my instigation to work on this. So I think, you know, I'd really like to see now that we have this really critical air monitoring system up, what are we going to do with it? And how do we get some action then on actually using this data, if not to shut down wells, at least to alert people when the levels are high.
Right.
And that, if I could speak to that point with the data, yes, we are using the data. We put the data together with our own data. You know, Boulder County, we only oversee the data from Boulder Reservoir, but also the data from the Longmont sites and the Broomfield sites. And we've used that in a few of the Air Quality Control Commission rulemaking so far, and we intend to continue using that. And to take it a step further, we've had wonderful analyses done already by our researchers of the monitoring data, but Boulder County has also hired researchers at CSU to do a modeling analysis of the data. And that report is in draft form. It's going through peer review, and we're hoping that that will be out early next year. And that will help us pinpoint the sources of the pollution even more. So we'll get percent contributions from, you know, from oil and gas, from vehicles, and from other sources out of that study. So it's been really, really helpful data, and we expect it to continue to be even more helpful in the near future.
That's great. Yeah, so a real sort of refinement of the scale of the data. That's very exciting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cindy. So we've had a couple questions come up about the recent fires, which I know are on everyone's mind. And I know this relates, again, both to water quality and air quality. But why don't we start with a discussion around fires and water quality? Jesse, you had flagged a question. Do you want to start by talking a little bit about what we can say about fire risk and water?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually just had a meeting last night with the fire recovery team for Calwood and Left Hand, and learned a little bit more about the modeling exercises that some of our partner scientists have conducted from the USGS and the US Forest Service and the CFRA or CU Fort Collins. And they basically illustrated the challenges we have ahead of us. So that includes the fact that the vegetation is burned off. We have these bare soils, which can lead to increased risk of soil erosion, as well as increased risk of debris flows coming down the hillsides and into our drainages. In addition, that can lead to increased flood risk for our communities. And so what we're doing to kind of combat those efforts and to make sure that we're tracking the potential changes and impacts to water quality and watershed health generally, is to proactively implement some recovery actions, which Boulder County is leading, and then also collect data. So fortunately, we have some good long-term data sites that we just presented in Left Hand and also in the St. Vrain Creek. And so we can basically come back out and collect those same sample points and collect BMI data when we have these events or after we have these kind of sediment-driven events that increase turbidity in the watershed and increase erosion. So we can track how it impacts our watershed thanks to collecting data for many years in advance, and then also can help inform our future management activities, including erosion control and follow-up adaptive management, which is going to be really crucial to get through the long-term recovery from the fires.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of those management strategies on the other side of that? How are we managing that erosion risk?
Yeah, so one of the key ways is actually in doing some aerial mulching. So you mulch the whole landscape with wood straw, which is like a wood. It just as it's described, it's wood straw. So that's one tool that we use. Another idea is actually creating these sort of check dam systems using straw bales or other means to be able to kind of stop and allow more drainage and spreading out. And then we have, in the long term, we want to create resilient systems which allow the sort of natural sediment filtration on the long term. So in Left Hand Creek, where we actually installed these beaver dam analogs, which are natural sediment filtration systems within a large kind of unconfined channel area, which will help adapt to future fire events and allow sediment water to spread out prior to getting to key diversion points, which are really important to keep agriculture, water to supplies to agriculture, as well as diversion points for municipal water, including Longmont's water supply and Left Hand's water supply. So really important that we all work together and do these recovery efforts that are really necessary. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jessie. So how about the air quality side of this? I know a lot of us felt the persistent burn over the last few months from the fires. So Cindy, go ahead and let us know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, there were, of course, enormous impacts air quality wise from the wildfires. And we've talked about ozone today, and that it's definitely an impact on ozone concentrations. But it's also, what you can see are the fine particulates from the fire smoke. And so that's another huge concern for public health, another lung irritant. And fine particulates not only cause lung problems, but they can also cause cardiovascular problems. And Karen, I'm not a medical expert, so Karen can probably go into more detail on that side. But as far as the air quality impacts and public health, it was really concerning. It felt like we were getting a double whammy with the ozone and the high particulate levels. And particulates are something that if we don't have fires in the summer, it's usually a pollutant of concern in the winter time, and it's not a summertime issue. And so yeah, that goes into what we're trying to do at the state level. Unfortunately, the data from the wildfire smoke can get excluded from the considerations for when they're looking at whether the area is attaining the standard, because it is, somewhat a natural event. We are arguing that with climate change, wildfire is not it's historically it's been called an exceptional event under the federal guidelines. and states are allowed to exclude that data and not count it against the area for attaining the standard. And we're trying to argue that it's, unfortunately, fires are increasing, as everyone knows. It's partially human caused. It's no longer an exceptional event. Unfortunately, it happens too often in the summer, and that we really need to do something to deal with it. And we can't stop the fires, unfortunately, from happening, but we can control and reduce further the pollution sources that we do have control over. And so we're trying to argue that approach at the state level.
Yeah. I will just say that the air monitors that we have monitor both PM10, which is the size of the particulate, and PM2.5. The PM10, of course, that's like the smoke might really affect your asthma, or, if you have heart or lung disease, it might really affect you. The 2.5, when that raises, that's actually a small enough little micron size piece that it can embed in your lungs and cause more long-term problems. And so, I think anybody who's out on a smoky day, that's one thing that I decided was good about our COVID response, is that all of us have masks. And I found that having a mask on just really, really helped me on those smoky days. And so, I think that that might be something that long-term we need to think about, is having masks available with that 2.5 filter long-term. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's appropriate.
sorry.
I wanted to ask Jessica if the fire retardant that's used, if that adds into our water pollution issues. But I think Cindy has something else on air first.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly respond to, we do caution people against, we don't want people to use the cloth mask that we've been wearing during COVID as a way to filter out the particles, because it doesn't filter out the particles that are microscopic, unfortunately. So we wouldn't want people to have a false sense of security when they're wearing the cloth mask. But as Karen mentioned, if you have the filter in it that's a PM2.5 or smaller filter, then that would be a lot better than just wearing a cloth, or even a surgical mask. Doesn't help a lot with the smoke.
Excellent. Go ahead, Jesse, regarding the water side.
Yeah, I can't quite remember what the chemical was that was previously in retardant that was a cause for water quality concern, but that's no longer used. So we did request the materials specification sheet from the contractors that used it, and there were no concerns from the water district regarding what they used.
Great, thanks. So I see, Cindy, that you've flagged a question regarding our large vehicle fleets and moving them over to electric as a way to mitigate the pollution coming out of tailpipes, especially contributing to ozone. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's another effort that's being taken at the state level right now. So the Colorado Energy Office has an electric vehicle plan. And additionally, the Colorado Department of Transportation has a clean trucking plan. And both of those plans are looking at increased electric vehicles. And a big portion of that is looking at large fleets. And not only, they're looking at the fleets, the state-owned fleets, but also companies with large fleets where they can change over those vehicles to electric vehicles. And so if people are interested, they can go to those websites, or I can also drop those two sites for CEO and CDOT into the Q&A. And that's another area where local governments from across the state have come together, and we're also speaking out in strong support of vehicles and changing them, more and more vehicles, as many as we can, to electric vehicles.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. So we have a couple of related questions to the use of pesticides and chemicals in the landscape and how that's contributing to some of the water quality concerns. So specifically, in general, I wonder if we could have maybe Helen or Jesse speak to how significant those sources are for water contamination. And then the specific question about the use of Roundup and whether there's been efforts to sort of control that use at any level.
Jesse, you may, I mean, I don't know specifically. I know it's bad. But Jesse, do you have specific
I
data?
don't. Yeah, I don't think I can answer this question either. I don't have a chemistry background in regards to weed killers.
Great, no worries. We can just punt that, not a problem. And then a related question, I think, is, the way we use land that introduces some of the concerns we learned about. So I want to, the question is specifically around sort of, can we repurpose certain lands? But I guess maybe I can broaden it a little bit and ask if you, Helen or Jesse, can speak to sort of how land use factors into this conversation, and if there's any sort of strategies to encourage the sort of land uses that are more conducive to maintaining water quality.
I can start off on just sort of a broad brushstroke, and Jesse, you probably have more details. But I know there is an effort by Boulder County and by certain nonprofits on a couple of fronts. One is to transition from sort of traditional GMO crops to non-GMO. One, to transition from using pesticides to organic methods of growing. That's happening statewide and I think regionally as well. It's not happening, as far as I know, from a policy perspective, but they're from a sort of statewide policy. But I know Boulder County has some federal money that they're using to help that transition happen within Boulder County. I will say, I think the progress has been slow, and there are a number of reasons for that. I think it's just not, it's just, you can't just sort of turn the switch off on one and turn the switch on another. It's a multi-year long process, because of soil health is one, a soil that's had pesticides in it and herbicides for years. It takes a lot of rehabilitation. It's a lot of sort of cultural change around how farmers think about using their land. That's the biggest thing I know about. I know part of the question was around specifically golf courses being repurposed. I don't know of any sort of effort like that. Yeah, I would imagine that golf courses specific, they're that would be tough.
Right. Thanks, Helen. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I can just chime in. I mean, generally, we're a non-regulatory nonprofit organization, so we don't actually do any kind of enforcement of like changes in land use and such. But what we do is provide, and we try to empower, the community and landowners to have the tools and resources to make educated choices about how they manage their own properties. And one example of that is our Regional Stream Stewardship Handbook, which is now an interactive website. And I can put the link in the chat box in a minute here. But it gives landowners tools to be able to implement stewardship projects on their own using the best available science and strategies. And so that's one example. And I would defer to our county partners in terms of kind of strategies that they're implementing on a policy level across the county.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'll also refer the audience to Thursday's third webinar panel, where we're going to speak a lot more specifically about land use and land cover, and also hear from some experts on sort of even things that we do in our backyard regarding pollinator gardens and planting certain kinds of plant species that support biodiversity and try to mitigate some of the land use changes we've seen in the area. So definitely check that out as well. All right, let's see. I think we've got a really interesting question that I've wondered as well over the last several months about the link between COVID and how we use resources. And I know this is a tricky one, and I don't know that we've got a firm answer, but I guess I'll just pose it, which is the question here is how the sort of, push to have everyone wash their hands, which is of course a very important way to protect ourselves and our neighbors from COVID, but how that contributes to water demand and water availability. And we might also broaden it to think about just the way our own behaviors lead to concerns about water demand and water availability. So maybe, Helen, I see you're nodding. Maybe you want to start with a kind of reaction to that. What's the role of residential uses?
Yeah, well, COVID has been so interesting as a sort of broad opportunity for self-reflection, personally and societally. I think that this great pause. But one study I did see that was quite interesting was to look at the emissions during the lockdown on the Front Range did not go down significantly, which pointed to, and some of you will know more about this than me, but which pointed to that the majority of the emissions are not coming from individual vehicles driving around, because that was the big change as people weren't commuting, but it is more the oil and gas and other polluters. But one of the questions was specifically around hand washing and water use. And you know, interestingly, I put this elsewhere in the chat, 80% of water use in Colorado does go to ag. And so the remaining 20% is municipal use. So our own personal use in things like watering lawns, taking showers. But the water, I think any conservation effort is fabulous. So turning the water off while you are soaping and lathering is great. But I don't think that the cumulative effect of longer, more intensive hand washing would make a difference on, or a significant difference on the water, overall water quantity used. Yeah, I'll stop there and see if there others want to jump in.
Yeah, and we can broaden it as well. Just, I'm curious, Cindy and Karen, if you see any shifts in air quality related to how our behaviors have changed in response to COVID. What can we say about that? Go ahead, Karen.
I was asked that question when there was sort of that national headline that that our air pollution was less, and I spent a few days watching the air monitoring that we have. And on different days, you can watch whether or not there's the propane and ethane, and you know, if those numbers are high. So some days, if those weren't high, you might have a little less, but it really didn't decrease. I can tell you as a nurse that if you get sick and end up in the ICU, because I spent a lot of time in ICUs, that you're going to use a lot of water. So wash your hands. It's a lot better use of our water than once you get into the intensive care unit and or make other people ill. Yeah, I don't think it's that much. I think if we concentrate on how we use water and, you know, on our lawns, you know, and also agriculture and you know, my big bugaboo is fracking. Uses a lot of water, and it is re-injected and is never able to be used again. It's injected back deep into the earth. So that would be my thought.
Thanks.
So
go ahead, Cindy.
If I can go back to the air quality piece, with the COVID impacts, one of the silver linings that we did see was decreased, you know, vehicle miles traveled is how, you know, vehicle use is calculated in the air quality world. And there definitely was a sharp decrease in that in the spring when Colorado had the stay-at-home orders. And so we did see increases. It depends on which pollutant you're looking at. And so there were decreases. You know, we saw some improvements in air quality. In particular, there are localized improvements from decreased traffic with nitrogen dioxide, which is a pollutant that stays, you know, it's from vehicles and it stays, you know, fairly local. You know, we did not see many improvements with ozone over the summer. And that's, you know, as I said before, ozone is from a variety of sources. There was maybe a very slight reduction in oil and gas production in Colorado. I think I heard that there were reductions more in other states, and Colorado, we didn't see as much of a reduction as maybe we would have hoped to improve our air quality conditions. And then of course we had the fires this summer. So we just had that impact. And I think, vehicle miles traveled has gone back up too, since people aren't staying at home quite as much. But it was an interesting kind of micro study in, the benefit of decreased vehicles, number of vehicles on the road. I think it's kind of brings up an exciting opportunity to look to the future when we have fewer vehicles on the road.
Sure, and even small strategies like work from home, kind of remote working opportunities that could help to reduce some of the traffic. Yeah. Thank you, Cindy. Well, we're about out of time, so I want to just take a minute to thank you guys all for your effort and time today. I can just say I learned a lot from hearing your perspective and the elaboration on the kind of trends that we saw in the ecosystem report. So thank you for spending time with us, and thank you also for the investment of time and energy to just generate this report from the start. And we look forward to engaging you again in the future. For the audience members, just a quick reminder that our third and final webinar will occur this Thursday from 4 to 5:30. And there we will investigate further the last two ecosystem trends, which are biodiversity and urban land cover. And I think you're probably seeing across this conversation clear evidence that all of these trends are really tightly interconnected. And we can kind of pull them out and talk about them in isolation, but at the end of the day, we really need to kind of think about the big picture. And so I hope that we're having a chance to circle back around and revisit how something like water quality is linked to biodiversity and urban land cover linked to how we use our resources. So please do join us for that event. And thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Thanks again to the panelists. And we hope to see you again. Bye-bye.